In 56 BC, when Marcus Licinius Crassus met with Caesar in the town of Ravenna, Caesar promised to send a legion to Rome after the campaign season, to make certain Crassus and Pompeius Magnus won election as the 55 BC consuls. When that legion arrived, it was led by Crassus's younger son, Publius Crassus, who had performed stunningly well in Gaul. Not only had Publius saved the day when, against Ariovistus, Caesar's left flank began to crumble, but he had contributed to Caesar's overall victory against the Veneti, by putting down the rebellious tribes in the area which would come to be known as Aquitaine. With Publius in Rome, Marcus Licinius Crassus availed himself of the opportunity to fulfill the marriage betrothal of his son, which had been arranged before Publius had reached the age of majority. In order to maintain his reputation with Rome's conservative families, despite discreetly funding populist politicians like Catilina, Clodius, and Caesar, Crassus had chosen to wed his son, Publius, to the daughter of Metellus Scipio. Her name was Cornelia Metella, and through her father, she was the great-granddaughter twice removed of Cornelius Scipio Nasica, the man who arranged the murder of Tiberius Gracchus, and the great-granddaughter 4 times removed of Cornelius Scipio Africanus, the man who defeated Hannibal. Making Cornelia Metella's ancestry even more illustrious was the fact that her father, as a young man, had been adopted by the late Pontifex Maximus, Metellus Pius. Besides the marriage of Publius to Cornelia Metella, Marcus Licinius Crassus strengthened his alliance with the Metelli clan even further by arranging the marriage of his eldest son, also named Marcus, to Cecilia Metella, the daughter of Metellus Creticus. With both his sons married, and the Lex Trebonia having granted him a 5-year proconsulship of Syria, with the right to invade Parthia, Marcus Licinius Crassus set out for his province in November of the 55 BC year. Arriving in Syria late in the year, Crassus began conscription of his army. Using his personal wealth, he raised 7 legions, approximately 35,000 men. From Rome's Hellenic allies in the east, Crassus also acquired 4,000 light infantry, and from King Artavasdes of Armenia, 6,000 cavalry. King Artavasdes, the son of the late King Tigranes, offered Crassus an additional 10,000 cavalry and 30,000 light infantry if Crassus would agree to invade Parthia through Armenia, which would hinder the movements of Parthia's deadly cataphracts and cavalry. Crassus, however, refused the offer, and marched across the Euphrates River into Mesopotamia. At the small town of Carrhae, which sat on the western side of the river Balak, Crassus's army encountered the forces of the town's commander, Silaces, whom he easily overpowered. As Crassus moved to overtake the towns of Nicephorium and Carrhae, Silaces, despite being wounded, escaped, and fled to the court of Parthia's king Orodes, to tell him of Rome's invasion. The town of Zenodotium, which shared the western bank of the river Balak with Carrhae, Nicephorium, and Carrhae, requested the placement of a Roman garrison for their protection. When Crassus sent the garrison, the people of Zenodotium murdered them, provoking Crassus to unleash Rome's fury on him as well. By the end of the 54 BC campaign season, Crassus had securely garrisoned the major strongholds along the Balak River's western bank in Mesopotamia. Satisfied with his initial progress, he returned to Syria to winter his troops. Needing more cavalry, Crassus, who maintained constant communication with Caesar throughout their individual campaigns, requested Caesar release his son, Publius, to his service. Agreeing, Publius Crassus, along with 1,000 of Caesar's Gallic cavalry, was transferred to Crassus, arriving in Syria before the campaigning season of 53 BC. King Orodes of Parthia, in response to Crassus's taking of major cities within Parthia's borders, raised 2 armies. The first army, commanded by himself, accompanied him in support of his mission to remove Armenia from the war. Once in Armenia, King Orodes came to an agreement with King Artavasdes, sealed with a marital contract between Artavasdes' son and one of Orodes' sisters. King Orodes' second army, which was all cavalry, and commanded by a general named Serena, he ordered to march toward Crassus, and delay the Romans until his arrival. Before Crassus left Syria, in the spring of 53 BC, he was visited by a Parthian ambassador named Vagases. King Orodes was prepared to allow Crassus the opportunity to retreat, and withdraw from Parthia altogether, despite his having already marched into Mesopotamia, and taking several of his cities. When pressed for his answer by Vagases, Crassus arrogantly responded that he would have his reply once Crassus reached Seleucia, the capital of Parthia. "O Crassus," replied Vagases, showing the palm of his hand, "hair will grow here before you see Seleucia." To continue funding his war, Crassus looted the temple at Hierapolis, and then marched into Judea to ransack Jerusalem's temple treasures as well. Crassus then drove his legions hard through Mesopotamia, where he received word of a Parthian army, just across the Balak River. One of his legates, Gaius Cassius Longinus, along with the other officers, advised Crassus to set up camp. His men had marched through Mesopotamia at speed. They were hungry, tired, and needed to rest. But Crassus had received word from Artavasdes, whom he did not know had entered into an alliance with Orodes, advising him that the brunt of Parthia's disorganized army was nearby. Pressured by his son, Publius, who was eager to fight, and earn for himself even more military accolades, Crassus ordered his men to eat a quick meal, and then forced his army to continue across the Balak River, and into the desert. Lured far from any source of water, Crassus's scouts finally found the army belonging to General Surena. Most of the scouts were killed, but a few made it back to warn Crassus. When the armies came within sight of one another, Surena tricked the Romans by hiding the depth of his army behind the width of his advance guard. He also ordered his deadly cataphracts to cover their armor with robes, so the Romans would think them typical cavalry. At first, thinking the Parthian army inferior, Crassus followed the advice of his quaestor, Cassius, and deployed his army in the traditional method, with infantry in the center and cavalry forming the flanks. However, at the last minute, Crassus suddenly changed his mind. So that his army could not be outflanked by the enemy, he ordered his forces to redeploy in a square. Beating hollow drums to unnerve the Roman army, Surena gave the order to charge. Wanting to turn the Romans' fright into horror, Surena commanded his cataphracts, who were at the front of the charge, to tear away their robes at the last minute, revealing their deadly nature. With their shields locked, the Romans endured the cataphract attack, and braced for impact from the charging cavalry. But Surena's cavalry split, riding down both sides of the Roman square. Once Surena's cavalry completely surrounded the Roman legions, a shower of arrows was launched. The Romans responded by forming the testudo, hoping to endure the missile fire until the cavalry ran out of arrows. But Surena had also brought 1,000 camels, loaded down with barbed arrows, which ran back and forth, continually resupplying the Parthian archers. Usually able to repel arrows, the Roman testudo was less effective against Parthia's barbed arrows, which were better able to pierce their shields. As the never-ending barrage of arrows pummeled the Roman square, arms and legs of Crassus's infantry were nailed to the insides of shields, and feet were nailed to the ground. As the Romans fell under the deluge of arrows, enveloped by the screams of the pierced, Crassus commanded his son to lead a breakout charge. Publius Crassus, taking several thousand legionaries and cavalry, broke out of the square, surprising the Parthian cavalry. When the Parthians turned and fled, Publius Crassus, not wanting to lose the advantage, pursued. Because the Parthian cavalry, while astride a charging horse, could fire arrows behind them, Publius and his men continued to endure a barrage of missile fire. Eventually, the Parthians slowed. Having successfully lured the charging Romans right into the reserves of death-dealing cataphracts, the Parthian army turned, and began attacking Publius Crassus' forces. Defeated by the ambush, Publius Crassus led those who survived the cataphracts' assault, to a nearby hill. There, so the Parthians could not take him alive, Publius Crassus convinced one of his legionaries to kill him. Crassus, still commanding from within the square, continued to witness his men falling under heavy missile fire. Having formed a square, instead of the standard Roman defensive line, the mobility of his army was severely hindered. However, Crassus still fought to move his men forward to rescue Publius, whom he did not know was already dead. Then the arrows stopped. The Parthians began beating their hollow drums again, grabbing the attention of the Romans. A group of charging horses approached the Roman square. A single rider came forward, and paraded himself before the Roman legions. Mounted atop the rider's spear, for Marcus Licinius Crassus, and all his men to see, was the severed head of his son, Publius Crassus. With the spirit of the Romans utterly broken, and Crassus paralyzed with grief, the Parthians now resumed their relentless storm of arrows.